The topic of diction is worth investigating because many world-known texts use diction to allow the reader to comprehend a deeper understanding of the meaning of the text. It is as simple as using words that have a stronger meaning. This topic is worth investigating into because diction can create a completely different interpretation and opens a bolder pathway to the purpose. The title of this presentation is going to be breaking up the text, and the goal of this presentation is to see how changes in the text can impact the story and analyze how the diction in the text can discover the tone of the author. Okay, so just before we get started, a couple of points about tone like to know, just so we can all be on the same page, is that the tone of the author can make like changes to the text. So basically, if the author is attempting to make his point that he's mad, the text is gonna change. The diction is gonna become more stronger. The mood is gonna be impacted more towards the specific scene of the text, the movie, whatever it is, in order to make his point. So it's gonna go up and down, and there's some climaxes. There's like all those things in that level is gonna change, and that changes because of where the story's at, because of the diction that's being used in that certain piece, like in that certain scene, like as it
Okay, so right here is that swirly action that I was talking about in the previous scene, and the rising action is usually what happens first in the story, and that basically begins with like subtle wording, and as you go on these steps, the wording becomes a little bit more like precise, and it is intended more for a reason. So the tone is changing the mood of the reader, and it is slowly becoming more and more intense. That rising action is what will then lead to what is called the climax, which is where the diction is chosen precisely and is chosen for a reason. And oftentimes the wording will be offensive and will have much action involved. So like it's where the lines become connected, and just everything just becomes more action. Like it becomes a lot more harsh on this part. So right after the climax comes the falling action, and the falling action occurs when the main problem of the story is resolved, and it's one of the elements of the plot of the story. So basically, like after the rising action, the climax is basically the resolution, and the falling action wraps up the narrative, and it resolves, like just makes everything more loose, and it leads to closure. So it just basically, the tone here, it steps down. So right here it stepped up, now it's stepping down. So words like don't really matter here, because the tone isn't really being used as much as right here, where it's harsh in order to get here. But once you're up the hill, it's a lot easier to get down the hill. So you don't really have to focus much on the tone here, as the action is being dropped.
So in this example, we can't really depend on diction to discover the tone of the author. As we can see on the left, there is a boy and it's sunny outside and he's at the beach. On the right, there's a boy and he's at the beach, but it's not sunny, it's actually raining. So we can see that they're both saying the same thing, but when we really think about it, they're actually completely different. So we can depend on the setting in this example to discover the tone of the author. The one on the left is enthusiastic about what he's saying. He's not being sarcastic, and he's being literal. And what he's attempting to say is that he's glad to be there, and he's glad to be there because it's sunny. It's a hot day. He wants to swim. However, the boy on the right is saying it he's saying so glad to be here, but he's saying it in a sarcastic tone. And although they're both saying the same thing, so we can't really use diction because it's the same word choice. But in this case, we can use the setting. It's not the right weather, it's not the right time, like, to be at the beach. So he's saying the same thing as the one on the left. However, he is implying a different meaning. He's using a sarcastic tone, and he's not being literal. And this is where it can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but once you have the hang of it, it should be pretty easy. So Jesus, can you describe the tone of Arthur Miller in The Crucible? Like, just from line to line, like, just give me your perspective on it.
Well, I think the tone changes dramatically because as it goes line to line, it's a different character in the story. So each character is addressing a different purpose or issue compared to the other person.
Oh, I see. Okay, so how can you determine the tone of the author in any piece of literature?
I think you can determine it from the setting, but most importantly, it will probably be the intended audience.
The intended audience, okay.
Because you're trying to convey the message to the reader, obviously, and depending on the tone, it's either gonna dramatically impact the reader or not as much.
Alright, I see. So, should we look at an example?
I think we should.
From the text?
Well, we just happen to have one right here.
Oh, would you look at that?
Would you look at that? It's right here.
Okay, so let's get to talking about some examples. So in line 1 of The Crucible, Reverend Paris is saying, "You will confess yourself, or I will take you out and whip you to your death, Tituba." Now we can see that he has a quite demanding tone, and he gets his point across by using violence and by using exclamation points at the end of his declaratives in order to achieve what he wants. This is a great example of when the author is using diction in order to release his tone. We can see that this is going to move the story forward because as he is speaking to Tituba that way, it will create drama within the other characters, which will ultimately create more dialogue between the characters and is going to switch up the tone within each line, thus creating a movie or story. And this is actually one of the most perfect examples in the book because it is a clear example of where the tone is being used in an excellent manner. So we can see that the quote that we just read, it's like right in between where the rising action is about to end and coming into the climax. So that's what I was talking about with the whole, like the violence and where it's becoming more intended, because Reverend Paris was talking, like he was talking specifically to Tituba. So that was extremely intended, and he was using harsh like language. And he was also using, like, he was threatening him, as we read here, or I will whip you to your death, and Tituba. So that's clearly intended towards Tituba. So that's right up there towards the climax.
Alright, George, we're just gonna interview real quick about The Crucible. Okay, so what do you think about the tone of The Crucible by Arthur Miller?
Well, it's like up and down. It depends on the story. Like, sometimes it's happy and other times it's sad.
And what is that dependent on?
It depends on the text and like the time of the story.
Starting on the second line of the short poem Africa to America by Phyllis Wheatley, she writes, "Taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew." In this quote, she's using a heartbreaking tone. We know that she's using a heartbreaking tone because of the use of her diction. When she uses benighted, what she's really saying is that she's uneducated and she's basically throwing herself under the bus. Benighted is a very sad word, and it means a lack of opportunity, and when someone is basically calling themselves benighted, it means that he or she is incapable of achieving success, which is pretty heartbreaking. She's also showing us how confused she was during the time of her kidnapping, by using benighted as a method of inconsolability. We also know that she is a woman who is a very serious person about her religion, and she's cherishing her knowledge about God, and that's the reason why she's alive today. Now to her, being a very religious person is probably the reason why she thinks that she's alive today. I mean, who knows really? But for someone being such a Puritan, it may seem like that's the reason why she thinks she's alive today, which is just her beliefs. Now that you understand my perspectives on tone a little better, this is where the video is going to conclude. But you know what they say, all good things have to come to an end, right? I hope my goals were discussed during the short span of this video, and hopefully you got to understand my ideology. It was an honor explaining my point of view on such an important literary device to my audience, and hopefully I did a good job. I appreciate your time and have a nice day, night, or whenever you're watching.